Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Health Matters with Laura Kopec. I'm your host, Laura Kopec. I am a traditional naturopath, functional nutritionist, health educator, coach, genomic specialist, and recently I had the pleasure of opening up my episode to a Q&A. And so you're going to hear a lot of different questions and answers in a live Q&A that we did or previously recorded, and I hope you enjoy. This and other podcasts are for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing recorded here or any of my podcasts are a substitute for medical advice. Go for it.
So I just kind of have questions on how do we get started on, like testing, and then how do we work through our genetic situation? Because we have a family that has a large amount of, diabetes and high cholesterol, high, blood pressures and all that. And it seems like it's the whole family, especially, like our older generation, now that we know better about how to work through it and better take care of ourselves. And then now, here's our generation. The doctors are just putting everybody on all this medicine, and I don't want to be on that medicine. So what are some steps we can do to because I'm sure I fall in the category of needing some help.
Great. Well, that's a really good question. So I'll just start by saying that we assume that diagnostic medicine is healthcare, and it really is acute disease management. And so the analogy I like to give is that when we go and see a doctor that treats in a traditional manner, we're going to see a plumber. And if we ask him a functional question or ask for functional help, we're asking the plumber to take a look at the breaker box and help us with our wiring. And plumbers and electricians don't really overlap unless you have a plumber that also, became an electrician. So I think as the general public, we need to understand that we're placing an unfair burden on a doctor when we need to be going and seeing a functional practitioner. And then there's a time and a place for those people to work hand in hand together. There is usually, I find, a natural product that is going to help the body without the side effects of a medication. So there's even ways to support, I think you were talking about diabetes and high cholesterol. The best thing when you're working with a functional practitioner like myself is you're going to have more success with supplements, with herbs of that nature, when you come in on the early stages. Things that have gotten really into a full-blown disease, then it's going to be a slower process to get, and maybe more supplements to get the body regulated. So I think you also had a question about genetics, and that's a really interesting, it's a topic I'm really passionate about. We think because we're testing our genes that we're looking at something that is black and white and has no gray and no subjectivity to it. But there are certain genetic testing that has that, but the testing that most of us are doing direct to consumer is really looking at what is called genomics. And that is a variation on the base pair that will cause it to increase risk. Okay, so when we talk about diabetes, the person with the genes, quote unquote, to diabetes, they don't have a genetic mutation that will give them diabetes. They have a genomic variation to the base pair, which leans their risk a little bit more in the direction of diabetes. Does that make sense? So when you have the risk for diabetes in the genomic testing that we have so far, it hasn't evolved to show the level of risk. That's called a polygenic risk score. And I do think in the next, decade or so, we'll see that kind of testing. So like when you take something like MTHFR, You're going to have some people have a greater risk for diabetes. Some people have a greater risk for heart disease. But basically, MTHFR means at some point you might be prone to inflammation. And so it is the epigenetic piece. It is that the diet, lifestyle, all our choices are epigenetics. And they cause those genes to open or close in a less inflammatory manner if we're proactive. Okay? I do all kinds of testing. If you're wanting to know where to jump in with me personally, the best thing is just get that initial consultation down. I can order traditional testing as well as functional testing. And I have a very, I've been doing genomics now for a really long time, and even, did some lectures at the university where I had my master's degree. So, okay, let's see. You can put your questions in the chat too, if that's helpful. So we've got a question there. Input, can you please give input on eating for your blood type? Dr. D'Adamo was one of the pioneers of functional medicine. He was doing food sensitivity testing early on when it was pretty unusual. And he came up with this theory that certain people with certain blood types, he kind of looked at all these people that were coming in and having food sensitivity testing, and he tried to see if there was a commonality between any of them. And he came up with the blood type, that people with blood type A were going to statistically be more inclined to test food sensitivity wise to certain food sensitivities. When you write a book, you're trying to appeal to everybody, so they kind of have a manual in their hands. And so when this first came out, it was a really revolutionary way of looking at food. I do find that when it comes to the acidic foods, the meats and grains, he's pretty spot on. I think over time that diet in terms of those meats and grains has really kind of, for the most part, upheld itself. But we're really influenced by the environment we live in. We inhale pollen, that creates, that alters our immune system. So when you look at fruits and vegetables, if a fruit or vegetable is native to that area that you live in, you're probably going to be more inclined to be more tolerant of it. But there's food, and then there's how our body is digestively wired in our microbiome. The organisms in our gut, they have their own DNA. They have their own intelligence. They group in social groupings, and they're going to dictate that they'll trump whether or not, your blood type, they'll trump your blood type. So if somebody's producing too much methane gas and they don't tolerate, avocados or sweet potatoes, doesn't matter what your blood type says, that's going to trump it. Okay, let's open it up to another question. Hi, Laura, what do you think about gluten and dairy-free diets for kids not having an allergy to either? Is having either dairy or gluten occasionally a setback in overall wellness? This is a great question. So when we talk about food, we have to talk about the quality first before we talk about what has to be eliminated, and then, of course, somebody's personal constitution. So gluten has become an inflammatory food. And so when we look at inflammatory foods, we have to think about how often should somebody have it, and the quality is certainly going to create a better tolerance to it. So kids in general have stronger immune systems, which means they're more resilient, which typically means, again, if a child is healthy and their digestive system has no real issues. For example, if a child has constipation, gluten and dairy are going to probably add fuel to that fire. But say everything is normal with that kid, and you want to make sure that on something that is inflammatory, that they're having it with the highest quality as possible. If you increase the quality of the food, you can increase the frequency. But if the quality is really low, then the frequency has to be lower. So I did a whole podcast on this about food on the spectrum. That's kind of how I like to think about it. You know, McDonald's hamburger bun, that's on the lowest end of a gluten spectrum. But, you know, a homemade with an ancient grain, that's going to be at a less inflammatory, higher quality on a better end of the spectrum. I think we have to be really careful with our kids how often we're restricting them. I think it's my personal opinion. I'm a mom to 3 kids. What was more important to me is that I taught my kids the always food, the sometimes food, the almost never food, the never food, and then vacation eating, and you know, what we're going to eat before a sports competition versus after with your friends. Because we do, the primary reason in this country that we eat is for socialization. We can't go anywhere, including church service now, and not have, you know, coffee bars, and it's integrated into everything. So we have to take that into consideration. And sometimes it's more important to teach our kids how to be responsible about the things they're putting in their bodies. So we set them up for success when they're going to be on their own in college. If it's a bubble that we restrict everything that's bad, that's like anything else in parenting. Sometimes that bubble doesn't always create resiliency, being able to navigate challenges and adversity. So sometimes it's kind of important to go, we're going to do this, but this is why, you know, but that the foundation that you're constantly really reinforcing, we eat vegetables, we eat food, we eat real food, we do that all the time, so that when we go on vacation and we're in a situation where we want to try this restaurant or this one, and there's less restrictions, then the foundation is really, really strong. And that means that their immune system is strong. And then if a child has a reaction to it, that's part of the conversation. Well, this is why we don't do this all the time. Okay, good question. Sugar, that's the big one. So sugar, when sugar was first, I love the history of sugar. It's really interesting. When sugar was kind of discovered, if you will, it was used as a drug. It was used in slavery. It was used in warfare. The same way that you see kind of historically in guerrilla warfare that they're using other narcotics. So sugar was a tool to really manipulate mental health and behavior. And so at some point it hit mainstream, and we don't even think about it as a drug. We think about it as a staple, and it's not a staple. And so we have to kind of, going back to that other idea of always food, sugar's not an always food. If sugar isn't always food, then it's going to have consequences somewhere down the line, whether that is behavioral. In kids, it's typically behavioral. It can be mental health by the time they're in puberty. But serotonin is mostly produced in the gut, and it provides a level of mental health, anti-anxiety, and people with disruptions in serotonin and dopamine, they can experience more anxiety and more depression. So we're not just what we eat in our digestive system, we're what we eat in our brain. Our brain is neuroplastic, it's spongy, and like literally we need, like our digestive system, we want to eat food and it turn over in 24, 48 hours. And the things that we don't use be evacuated through our elimination system, because that's how it's one of the immediate ways we deal with inflammation. Well, our brain actually does that too. I think it's one of the coolest things that our brain will shrink while we sleep. So literally, it's like sleep creates a squeezing on the sponge, and then the inflammation is supposed to leave that sponge and enter into the cerebral spinal fluid, where it will eventually find its way into our elimination systems. But when we're overwhelming our systems with inflammation, and you can call it, you know, processed food, sugar, sodas, artificial ingredients, when it's not clean and the body can't keep up with it, it just builds up in the system. You know, even things like Alzheimer's, we're looking at many different kinds. It has to do with that there's so much plaque and inflammation that not enough can exit when that sponge gets squeezed. And so the body starts to create more plaque to try and create a barrier to it. And that's when we have problems with transferring information and memories. But, you know, sugar is a significant mood regulator. It has an addictive side to it, again, because it's playing with those neurotransmitters. So as parents, we need to decide good boundaries, good limits, again, the things that are harmful that we put into our body. I kind of have conversations so that I'm setting my kids up to understand alcohol, right? How to drink responsibly. We want to teach our kids how to eat responsibly. Question, we've got another question here. Going into yet another pandemic fall in a few months, what are the main areas? So what are the main areas we can focus on to stay healthy? Okay. A couple things about viruses, because if that's what we're talking about when we talk about pandemic. So viruses are constantly changing. They are much more fluid than bacterial infections. So a virus, when it enters its host, is going to adapt to that host's body and immune system within 15 minutes. This is why something like COVID has been fairly complicated and confusing, why some people have no symptoms, why some people wind up in the hospital. And you're really also talking about the predisposition that the host is in prior to infection, right? So going back to that inflammation and how we push inflammation out of the body, if what we're doing doesn't allow our body to filter and eliminate inflammation, basically we're pouring way too much lighter fluid on that fire, we can't get it under control, then the environment that the germ enters is already too wounded, basically. And so when the immune system is dealing with a high level of inflammation and it can't regulate itself to the baseline, then a viral infection can have kind of a heyday in adapting itself, because you already have high activity in inflammation, you have a confused immune system, and the nutrients that become that military. So definitely listen to the podcast that I did about the immune system on the military as a military operation. It is one of my favorite analogies that I use to help people understand. We eat food that contains nutrients that eventually becomes the soldiers that fight that fight. So if you want to talk about what we need to do to get healthy, you know, take basic good supplements that you can't get enough of just from eating, like vitamin D, and then make sure that you're eating as clean as possible as a foundation, so that when inflammation comes to you in a variety of different ways, including illness, your baseline is ready to support that. Good question. I think, you know, COVID's been around now for a few years now. Forms of COVID actually existed in the 1960s. You know, it's just that this one was so aggressive. But what also happens as a virus moves through the planet, it becomes more contagious, so it's faster moving, but it also loses its umph, if you will. It becomes less serious. That's just the natural progression of the way a virus moves through the environment. Summers, you know, heat, extreme weathers don't always help our immune system. So we have to be even more considerate of our inflammatory load in extreme temperatures. You'll also see a trend in the immune system, cold and flu season, right? It begins right around October, right before Halloween. We have that extra sugar through the holidays. We eat extra sugar. And then, you know, Valentine's Day, Easter. So we have this window where people are sick on an ongoing basis. And it's really, if you kind of look at the way everybody, the population's immune system moves through the increase in sugar, it's really kind of interesting. I mean, sugar definitely suppresses that immune system. It does it significantly based on the amount that we do. And so, you know, definitely not only that baseline, but when you get sick, you got to take those inflammatory foods out to not overwhelm your immune system. You know, eat as simple and clean. There was a reason why chicken soup was an old wives' tale. It was about, you know, chicken, vegetables, broth, removing all the cakes and breads and cookies and whatever else that just suppress the immune system's ability to be on its top of its game.
Can you help me understand carbohydrates and just the sugar issue? I'm not sure I understand how many carbohydrates a person's supposed to have, like per meal, per day. And then how do you know, like they say Cheerios is good for you because it helps reduce cholesterol. But then you look at it and it's like 29 carbs. I don't know what to do. Like, what does that mean? Only 1 gram of sugar, but 29 carbs? Because I know those carbs are turned into sugars. So,
good question. Okay, so let me make sure I'm writing some of this down so that I don't. And if I miss something in my explanation, definitely circle back around. Okay, carbs. So the macronutrients, the 3 main categories of food are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. If we look at the way the Krebs cycle works, is our digestion moves through carbs, proteins, and fats. That's kind of the direction it moves in to break down our food. Carbs are very dependent on quick bursts of energy to burn them off. So if we eat more carbs than we can burn off, we don't really even effectively get to the proteins and fats, okay? Carbohydrates that don't digest become visceral fat. And that's the fat on a body that's much harder to burn as a clean fuel. Good fat, like essential fatty acids, we burn that pretty efficiently, but it is the visceral fat that gets stored. So it's not always it's not a black and white question of how many carbs. Kids are more active, athletes are more active. You have to make sure that your carbs equal your energy output so that you actually utilize those carbohydrates and get into utilizing the protein and your fat. As we age, our metabolism slows down. So we need kind of less of everything to complete the whole energy cycle of converting food to nutrients and energy. It's why, you know, people have problems with their weight as they age when they might not have when they were kids. So you always kind of have to look and go, does my activity level justify the number of carbs I'm doing? Or look at your body and see, if your weight is stable or going up as you age. So what are carbs? The good carbohydrates that are really low in even natural sugars they're the darkest and they have the most amount of nutrients. Blueberries, blackberries, all those berries, they're the lowest number of carbs. And carbs is actually what we're measuring is all the sugar kind of molecules, the glucose, the fructose, the sucrose. So that's why it would, protein is protein, fat is fat, but carbs has many elements to it, many types of sugars. So you want that alkalinity, that anti-inflammatory of those dark colors, and you have more wiggle room to eat more of those because they're really low in carbs. So you take something like those dark leafy greens. If you ever experiment with measuring your carbs on an app, you're going to find that things like blueberry are lower carbs. Bananas are really high in carbs. If you get something like, bread, it's even higher. If you get into alcohol, even higher, because the sugar concentration in those foods are even higher per gram per molecule. And so that's where you need the anti-inflammatory alkalinity of those really color-rich carbs. They also run the immune system because they're rich in antioxidants, natural killer cells, vitamin D, all those. Nutrients are color. They just are. So if you're looking at your total carbs, most adults need either less carbs or more downtime to process the carbs they're eating. So that's where the whole idea of intermittent fasting has come in. Our bodies actually, during sleep, go into fasting because melatonin, it's a natural hormone, it suppresses insulin. Melatonin's released during darkness. So during darkness, we're not digesting. So if we're not digesting, that's something to really watch. If you want to extend that fasting window, it gives your body more downtime to deal with the food that you are eating, or you want your carbohydrates to be able to be used during that time. Did that answer the question about what is carbs and how do you think about them to the person that asked?
Yes. Okay. So,
Cheerios. Let's go ahead.
Yeah, it helps kind of understand because you're saying our carbs are really our fruits and our vegetables that we need.
The good carbs, yeah, good carbs.
More so than our Cheerios. Just trying to figure out, what to do to kind of get a good grasp on which direction I need to be heading.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with processed, okay, so you take something like Cheerios, so we're moving into a more intelligent consumer when it comes to food. And we're much more as women and men too, but we're more health conscious. We want to understand food. So the marketing on these foods are going to lean into that. The word natural in the front, the law says that it only has to be a certain percentage to use that word on the front of a label. So it may not be 100% natural just because we see the word natural. If it says no artificial ingredients, that doesn't mean it's natural. That means it contains no artificial ingredients. So we have to really understand what's happening in packaged and processed food, how to navigate the difference between what is packaged and what's processed, right? So if you turn over the box, if something's packaged and you want to know if it's processed, turn the box over, read the ingredients, and if you know where those ingredients are sourced, then it's mostly packaged and not processed, right? We can go into Sprouts and get sourdough bread in the bakery section. That's packaged compared to going into, a regular grocery store and walking down the bread aisle and all that stuff's going to sit there. with dough conditioners in it, so that it doesn't lose its softness. You can buy a bread that says no high fructose corn syrup in it. Doesn't mean that bread's good for you if it's got chemicals to keep it preserved. So that food on the shelf is already designed to be slow to break down. So that is even going to butt up against a slower metabolism, right? So that's the quality of food. If you're going to use your carb allowance on bread, the fresher the bread, the more that bread is going to be turned over in your digestive system, versus something that's already, you're already set up to fail before you even have that. So, I mean, I haven't looked at a Cheerios label in a long time, but most of the time when I work with people with high cholesterol, it's not cholesterol foods like meat and eggs that is the reason their cholesterol is up. It is the sugars. It is the carbs. It is navigating their carbs. At some point in their aging process, cholesterol is an inflammatory substance once it reaches a peak. So most things in our body, if you imagine we have these buckets and they fill with certain things, and we need them to fill with certain things to do certain things. So like cholesterol is meant to regulate hormones. It's meant to protect the brain. So everybody needs their cholesterol at a certain level. When the bucket overflows, then the liver is just making an inflammatory substance to keep up with the amount of inflammation it has. So when I work with somebody, I'm looking specifically, what is the inflammatory burden in their diet? Most of the time with cholesterol, it is the carbs. It is the amount of sugars that they're doing that just overflows that bucket to the point where it can't be controlled. But you take the medication for high cholesterol, the statin just pushes that cholesterol back, and your body can no longer regulate what the cholesterol it does need to protect the brain, which is why the side effect of a statin is dementia. So you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, as opposed to, because your body's you're still throwing inflammation at it. You're just using a medicine to control one of the warning signs. And that inflammation is still there, and your brain can't keep up with it, and your body can't keep up with it. So be careful on those marketing techniques that are used to appeal to a new generation of food consumer that doesn't understand the labeling. But look, if you find yourself, in a hotel and they're doing that breakfast bar and you grab those Cheerios instead of the Fruit Loops, you're at least moving up the spectrum. See if you can add some blueberries in it to kind of get some anti-inflammation there, if you're stuck doing that kind of thing. There's always a way to make something better and make it worse. And if you find that you really like your Cheerios, and make sure you're getting a salad in at lunch so that you're kind of, again, running that interference and making a really strong baseline. But the idea that Cheerios will remedy cholesterol, that's just not true. So red light has been clinically studied to improve hormone levels, especially testosterone. As we age, we have a depletion of hormones. There's a lot of food that we eat that are hormone disruptors. They create confusion because, again, they're inflammatory, and things like, fake estrogens can confuse the way that the hormones regulate. It's not for everybody, the red light therapy. I do think it needs to be combined with some good herbs. If you're looking specifically at improving testosterone levels, then you might want to look at an herb called tribulus. I think it's one of the more effective testosterone adaptogens. But I don't know that I've seen anybody get their testosterone levels normal with just red light therapy. And of course, some of them are really expensive, so you just have to be careful on which one you decide.
Do you have a baseline idea of how much it would cost to get started working with you on some of these issues?
Oh, yeah. So, okay. So I'm really about helping people get a plan that they feel comfortable with, that they'll be compliant with. And so that has to fit a lot of different things, right? That has to fit their willingness to make those changes, their budget. So I have the opportunity in being very, very customized to navigate that. So for example, the first cost is my initial visit. It's an hour, it's up to an hour long. Sometimes it's a little bit less, but you're going to come out of that with a treatment plan and some strategies that I'll make some recommendations based on, you know, hearing how you want to do this, prioritize it, what are your main concerns, you know, and then with that plan in place, then we move into the next step. So if somebody wants to do a hormone panel, I use Senesco Neurolabs because I do the functional hormone panel that shows neurotransmitters, cortisol, DHEA, as well as the 3 estrogens, progesterone, and testosterone. I think women's health, when you just go have just your hormones tested by blood, it's very narrow, and in a way I find very dismissive of how complex women's health can be. So it's really important to understand if somebody's testosterone is low, that they may not want the option of doing even bioidenticals or doing pellets. They may want to know, well, is your testosterone low because your DHEA is low? And is that low because your cortisol is high? And is that high because you have no excitatory neurotransmitters, because your dopamine is really, really crashing? And then is that happening because of of diet, and we need to bring supplements? Is that happening because of something else, a genetic component? So it really is about how to prioritize what you want to do. I definitely have people come in, they're like, I just want to work on my blood sugar and my cholesterol because my doctor says I need medication. And they just want to do those things. They don't want, and I have some people come in and they're like, I don't want to get COVID. And while there's you can't put a bubble around yourself, you can certainly, again, make that baseline really strong. So you can come in and say, this is what I need to focus on. I need it to be this is my budget for the next 6 months. How would you suggest prioritizing that? And then, we go from there. Usually if somebody needs functional testing, there's still some options to experiment with some supplements. I mean, I've been reading functional testing for so long now. I know certain symptoms are going to show up as certain levels on certain tests. And so, sometimes people are like, I really need to see it. And if I think there's an infection, we have to find out what it is. We can find out how to treat it. It'll get cultured. But, if somebody's saying, I can't afford to do testing, but I need the best opportunity to, get out of this state, then I'm going to recommend, how to prioritize that with the least amount of things. Because the big problem is that we're not heard in healthcare, right? That's the biggest complaint. We go to a doctor and everything is a machine and we're being moved through there. People need to be heard. And when you listen to people, you can help them take charge of their health because they get to participate in the navigation of that. I mean, I have people and they're like, I need to know if my supplements are working. And we do a full functional panel. It's around $400. But they're spending a lot of time, money, and energy in supplements, and we need to know if that's working. So to feel empowered that you can participate in taking charge of your health, there's a much more successful compliancy at the other end of that, especially if you can have somebody like myself as an educator, really explain it to you. You know, if we don't eat antioxidants, we don't have the army to fight the virus. It's that kind of, you know, simplistic strategies that we need to have so that we can navigate and make commitments to those things.
I comment?
Yeah, please.
So, so thank you so much. You helped my son tremendously. And the other day he reached out and said, "Mama, I need you to help you."
Aww.
And so he begged me to reach out and get some help. And so it's a long journey. I'm caring for my mother-in-law that is dementia, and my mom that's diabetic and high blood pressure, and her dementia's gotten really bad. And then, of course, having your precious child that's so sick.
Yeah.
You know, that you're afraid you're going to lose them. And then I find it real hard to put a value on my own life.
Yeah. We somehow, you know, we've and it comes up through multiple generations, where as moms, we think our job, the primary job as a mom is to sacrifice ourselves. You know, and what we don't realize is our primary job as a mom is to take care of ourselves. But we don't live in a culture, and again, through the years, the way women and mothers have been, you know, treated, we're not in a culture that really prioritizes that. It can feel too selfish. It can feel like, you know, oh, I've got to do these things first because these other people are more important. But yeah, how wonderful that your son said, you know, you got to take care of you. I need you to take care of you. And oftentimes when people see their parents start to face health consequences, you know, it can be really awakening as to, you know, how do we prioritize? You know, if there's a family history of something, then it's pretty important to lean into that first, especially because anything with a family history means either we have learned those diet and lifestyle habits, right? That's the epigenetics, which amounts for more than 70% of anything. Or we do have the genetic risk, but again, the genetic risk is only going to be anywhere from 0.5% up to 30%. It's still going to be the environment we put our genes in on a day-to-day basis that makes up the rest of that risk. So if you've got family members that you're seeing multiple where inflammation is in the brain, then, you know, we need to look at your sleep, because that's where inflammation, that's where your brain squeezes that sponge, right? We need to look at, you know, the plaque, the way that your body, you know, are you eating enough? One of the ways that our brain brushes plaque is with blueberries. You know, they're even testing blueberries in the Center for Age-Related Diseases. So, you know, looking at cholesterol, things that eventually have an impact on the brain. But we can make that field very narrow if you have the most concerns about things that are going on in your family around you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Question here is, I see two questions, so I will answer both of them. I'm considering doing a hormone panel. Would that include reviewing supplement use as well? Or is that a separate test? Okay, so when I do the hormone panel, there are supplement recommendations to adjust the hormone levels, right? So sometimes, again, they're connected, so there's a prioritizing. If low dopamine is causing high cortisol and then low DHEA, we don't need to fix everything with necessarily with multiple supplements. It may mean just going for the heart of why the trickle down effect is happening, and then kind of seeing where somebody is feeling. Or we may need to, if the deficiency is so great or the excess is so great that we need to do a short round of supplements. But if you're looking, if the question is, so I mean, I review that supplement treatment plan that somebody has and I make adjustments in it with the hormone panel. But if you're looking at the big panel that shows you if all your vitamins are working or if you need something different, that's a NutriValve, and so that's a separate test. So for women, I definitely recommend that hormone panel. Has been a game changer for everybody that's done it, both men and women. I definitely recommend that if you have any mental health issues, if your doctor's trying to give you progesterone and you don't know if you need it or an antidepressant, make the commitment to that panel, and we can wait on the NutriValve. And the NutriValve can be staggered. Once you do that, it can be done, every couple of years. It's a big test. And unless there's major crisis going on, somebody with chronic migraines, it's too complicated without that test if they don't respond, immediately. So I would say if you're trying to prioritize testing and you're considering the hormone panel, you haven't done it, and you already do supplements, that's the one to commit to. Oh. Okay, I struggle with constantly spending so much time in the kitchen to make healthy foods. This is a good one, and the way that I kind of navigate it is, because yeah, you don't want kitchen fatigue, right? Is that I usually spend time in one thing. So for example, if I'm going to make chicken, then the sides are going to have no time for me. So that salad might be sliced cucumber. If I'm baking the chicken, then I'm going to get the potatoes in there so I can make use of the oven at the same time. But again, I'm not prepping anything. If I decide I'm going to make this big salad, then that might be with, leftover chicken or something that, again, I toss in the oven, like a baked salmon. So you probably want to think about the pieces and maybe move them around a little bit, because all healthy foods does not have to take time. It takes no time to grab a banana or even slice it and sprinkle some cinnamon on it, right? So what does take time is if you want to make, slice that banana, put it on an almond pancake, but, maybe look at, like my kids know that I'm only going to make almond pancakes maybe once a month, and I'm going to make maybe a double batch and it'll go in the freezer. So maybe they'll have it twice a month, but look at the way you're organizing that so that you can cut down on that time. It can be done. Yeah, I find other cultures to be really interesting. So it's called the French paradox, right? And the French really have, everybody's always confused about, well, why can they eat cream and butter and cheese and bread and and part of it is when they do those things, it's from scratch. It's just a whole different way about thinking about inflammatory foods so that we can have those things. So when I go in my kitchen and I'm going to spend time on something, it's going to be because I want to enjoy that, and I don't want to pay the consequence for just, grabbing it off the shelf of a grocery store.
Well, there you have it. That was our first open Q&A. Really excited to have done that, and a big thank you to everyone that participated. And again, everyone's health is really unique, and I have the privilege of really learning the uniqueness of people's health and really helping them customize plans for themselves. So we hope that a lot of the information is of interest and value to you. Remember, it is for educational, informational purposes. Do not use anything you've heard in a podcast to give yourself medical advice. All right. We will hopefully see you at our next episode of Health Matters with Laura Kopec.